Hello, everybody, and welcome back to my podcast. I'm your host, Mindy Raquant. So, as you can see, we have a new microphone and a new setup. So, I'm really excited to get into what this video is going to be about. So, we're going to be talking about sex. And when I first got married, obviously it was very brand new. And it was something that I didn't know much about, and I've learned so much since then. It's been, goodness, close to 5 years. I think this summer is going to be 5 years since we got married. So I have learned a lot, and I want to just talk about more the backstory of it, and then in part 2 I will talk more about that. So yeah, when we were first married, I just couldn't open up to receive Mike's love for me very much at all. It was just really hard for me to receive what he had to give me. And Mike wasn't doing anything wrong. It wasn't his fault. He was just a man trying to love his wife, and that really triggered me. His efforts were met with a lot of resistance on my part, and I just couldn't be there for him emotionally, and obviously that was really, really hard for him. I had previously been hurt by men, and so in my mind it just seemed like Mike was just another predator, and that I was his victim, and you can imagine what that did to our sex life. It really was not pleasant, and he learned to read my body language, and so whenever I would pull back or shut down, even emotionally, he learned to read that, and he would stop. And I'm not gonna lie that there were times that I would pretend that I was okay, even though I was struggling, just so that I didn't hurt Mike, because I just felt so horrible that I was literally ruining our sex life and ruining our unity. And so I would just try to pretend that everything was okay, but thankfully Mike could see that, and he has discernment as well, so he could tell when I was struggling. So he would just give me space, and our marriage was not pretty. It was not very intimate or close on any level for like at least a year, I would say. Marriage was where a lot of wounds and pain popped up from my past, and yeah, Mike would sometimes ask me if I was sure he would ask me if I was sure that I had never been sexually abused, because a lot of my sort of symptoms, I guess you could say, looked like sexual abuse. Just pulling back from sex so deeply and shutting down and getting triggered and all this stuff, it would look as though I had been sexually abused, but I have no memories whatsoever of sexual abuse, and I don't believe that I was physically sexually abused. But there are many different layers or levels of sex, and physical is just one of them. There's spiritual, there's emotional, there's mental, and there's just so many layers to it. And so I would say that I was abused in other ways. And so to talk about those things, I'm gonna have to go back in time and talk about my growing up years, and this is not an easy topic, so just bear with me. So if you didn't know this already, I grew up Mennonite, and there's just a lot that goes into that. So I'm going to go over some of those things and talk about what that looked like as a child. So in the Mennonites, there is a very, very strong culture defining men and women, and it's all about men working jobs, being leaders, and women being homemakers and being submissive. And it comes from scripture. 1 Corinthians 11 was a very, very strong scripture passage that was always referenced in regards to this Genesis, the creation story, and 1 Timothy 2 and Ephesians 5. I'm going to pull out my Bible here, and I'm going to read 1 Timothy 2, a few verses in 1 Timothy 2. So I'm reading from the NLT in case you are also going to read it. Here's 1 Timothy 2. I'm not going to read the whole chapter, but it's talking about men and women and the order of that, and it talks about how women should be modest in their appearance, and it talks about women should learn quietly and submissively, and Paul says, I do not let women teach men or have authority over them. And so, yeah, it says, let them listen quietly, for God made Adam first, and afterward he made Eve. And it was not Adam who was deceived by Satan, the woman was deceived, and sin was the result. But women will be saved through childbearing, assuming they continue to live in faith, love, holiness, and modesty. So those were some very strong verses that were always referenced in regards to this. But the thing is that their take on these verses was very, very literal and very religious. And so what happens when religion comes together with a command of Scripture, it removes the heart of God from it, and it becomes a lifestyle that is put in place by the leadership of the church. It's no longer about living in a way that's pleasing to God. It becomes all about pleasing the church leadership, and whatever the church leadership says is what you do. And if you dare to do anything differently, then you're just labeled as a rebel, and well, you're not allowed to do that. As long as you're part of the church, you just don't. And if you want to do anything different, you just have to leave. And so that's what makes stuff like submission and homemaking go from a very beautiful, godly, biblical thing to a control issue. And it's shown by stuff like the lifestyle of women in that setting was that women were not allowed to have jobs unless it was cleaning jobs or babysitting or teaching in their own schools, because the Mennonites have their own private schools, and so they needed their own teachers. And so there were just an abundance of single women who were allowed to fill those positions. So that's what would be the case in that culture, and growing up in that culture, you have to be a good girl and obey all the rules. If you dare to even question anything, then you're labeled as a rebel, and you're just pushed down to get in your place. I remember one time when I was a teenager, I actually said that I didn't want to marry a Mennonite guy, and everybody laughed at me because you don't say stuff like that. And guess what? I grew up and I didn't marry a Mennonite guy, so there's that. But in that culture, men and women are, the way that they relate to each other is very defined. And as I was thinking about this in preparation for the episode, I wasn't even sure what to do. I was like, is this funny? Is this sad? I think it's probably some of both. But so as a teenager, you would never, ever, ever, ever in a million years be caught with a boy alone. Even if you were just having a conversation, being in a friendship with a boy was considered a terrible thing, and it was if you looked at a boy's eyes, you would probably end up sleeping together. That was the mindset that was around relating to the opposite gender, was that if you got into any kind of close proximity, it was a terrible thing, and it would probably end up with you two in bed together. Okay, that's absolutely weird, but there was absolutely zero physical touch. You would never, ever, ever even think about giving a boy a side hug. You just didn't do stuff like that. So, relationships with boys was in a group setting, and that was it. There was just nothing else. There was just no possibility that would ever happen. And when you got older to more of a dating age, like after age 18, the more it was not acceptable for a girl to show any interest in a guy whatsoever. If you did have any interest in a guy, like you could, the less you could show it. Like you couldn't, if I liked any guy, I could not in any way show that I was interested in him, even down to eye contact or making small talk, because there was a possibility that if you looked at a guy's eyes or if you said the wrong thing to him, that he would potentially take that to mean that you were interested in him or something, like you were flirting. And so it was just like a big no-no. So a girl had to wait for a guy to show any interest in her. The way that it worked was that the guy would go to the girl's dad and he would ask for permission to court his daughter. And some dads were reasonable about it, but then there were a lot of dads who would put like really unreasonable stipulations onto the guys and demand that they had a certain amount of money in their bank account, or I couldn't think of any good examples, but it was just some dads were not that reasonable in their expectations of men. Like they expected them to be perfect in order to court their daughters. So it was just, in my opinion, the dads were being a little too unreasonable. But if everything did line up and the couple was allowed to get together, only at that point could the guy ask the girl to court him, and then if she said yes, then they would start courting officially and they would be a couple. But during courtship, there was no physical contact whatsoever. Even if you were sitting next to each other on the couch, you had to keep separate. Like you couldn't let yourselves touch even in that way. Well, I'm not going to get into that. Having a chaperone was highly recommended, if not mandatory, a lot of times. You basically had no chance of truly getting to know each other, because like who's going to be really vulnerable with each other emotionally when you have a chaperone? Like, I don't know, it just felt a little weird. But the first physical touch that a couple had was after you walked down the aisle together on your wedding day. Yep. After you walked down the aisle on your wedding day, at the end of the aisle and you join hands, that was like the first physical touch that you possibly could have. And I actually remember when I was, I don't know, 17 or 18, I went to a Bible school, which was in that culture, they would just have certain churches have a week of meetings where they would have different preachers come in and teach, and it was like they would have a song leader lead everybody with songs, and yeah, it was just like a week of community. And so during that week of Bible school, I remember they had one session where the one preacher was talking about how you need to save yourself for your future spouse, which is great. Like, you definitely do need to save yourself for your future spouse, but they were saying that you need to vow that you will never have physical contact before your wedding, and especially stuff like your first kiss and whatever. They were like spelling it out, what kind of physical contact that you couldn't have, I mean, which was nothing. But then at the end of it, they made us all stand up, and well, I forget how they said it exactly, but it was like, if you want to keep yourself pure for marriage, then you need to stand up right now and vow that you will never do these things. And so I stood up, because if you didn't stand up, you would look like an absolute heretic. And so we took this vow that we would never do these things before marriage. And so that's how they did it. That was how you keep yourself pure for each other, and that was how you did it. And so the question is, did all of those rules and did all of that physical abstinence actually work? And what did it actually do after you got married? Did it produce a healthy sex life? Maybe it protected you before marriage, but what about after marriage? Like, what did it actually do to your heart? And if you can't trust your body to have self-control before marriage, if you need all these rules to follow, then what does that say about after marriage? I always had so many questions about that, and I left the Mennonites at the age of 21. It was like a month before my 21st birthday, and I had so many unhealthy mindsets as a result of all of these rules, and it was all so deeply ingrained in me that I didn't know what to do with myself when I was free. And I only had 11 months between my time of leaving until the time that I was at my wedding day. So I had a very short amount of time to work through everything and learn who I was and all that. And so you can definitely see why I had so many issues. And I just want to say, I don't think that parental involvement is wrong. Boundaries are very good, and I think self-control is very good and very wise. However, in the context of religion, it all shifts from a good thing to an issue of control. It goes from like, we're waiting to have sex until marriage, to, which is good, to we can't even touch any part of each other before we say I do. And that's an issue of control. That's not an issue of like figuring out for yourself what you don't want to do and what you do want to do. It's like, you have to obey this, otherwise you're just absolutely condemned. The couple has absolutely no say in what they do. So an even deeper problem than that is that it completely bypasses the heart. The heart of the problem is what is really important. It goes right past holiness and purity to what's all about the outside, and it's just being righteous outwardly and not necessarily in your heart. And so that means that there's actually a lot of sin and lust happening right under the pretext of marriage, and right under the pretext of holiness. So you can wait to have sex until marriage and still be full of lust. And so sadly that was the case for a lot of people. And so something that I haven't talked about yet was that women in that culture were required to have a very high standard of modesty. Full-length dresses, elbow-length sleeves, and we had to wear head coverings. We were not even allowed to cut our hair. I actually did cut my hair because I had such thick hair that it was actually giving me headaches, and it was actually considered a bad thing that I did that, and I kind of tried to keep it a secret that happened, because if it had been found out, then I could have gotten in trouble. So we also couldn't wear any jewelry or makeup or anything like that. The color red was bad because there was something about in the Bible that a harlot wore red, and so that made red a bad color. So the fact that I had to cover my body so thoroughly, it actually made me feel less protected, and I knew that the men around me were not giving safety and protection. I'm talking about spiritual principalities controlling people's behavior. I'm not attacking any one person, because I don't think that's what it's about. I think it's about the spiritual aspect of it. So I could see the lust in the guy's eyes. I could see what they were thinking when they looked at me, and it wasn't true of every man. There were some men in the church who I knew were safe, but there were others who I knew that they were not safe, and I began to expect it of men. So I want to read a verse. I want to read Matthew 5:27 through 28. So it's in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus is talking about adultery. So Matthew chapter 5 verse 27 through 28. You have heard the commandment that says, you must not commit adultery. But I say, anyone who even looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So that verse it seemed like men took that verse to mean that they couldn't even look at women at all because we were somehow like taboo. And it made me feel like I was taboo, like I was this unwanted person. I wasn't even hardly a person to men because it was just, if like I just had so much power to make a man lust over me that if he even looked at me that he was probably lusting after me. um it was like, were they so afraid of us, or were they so ashamed of us, or were they ashamed of themselves? Like, it was always kind of a weird feeling. And I got the impression that men were just a bunch of monsters, and that I couldn't even hide from them. And Jesus saying in that verse, he's not saying don't look at a woman with don't look at a woman with lust, isn't saying don't look at a woman. It's saying look at a woman with love. Look at a woman to see her as a person, as a human being, as somebody who is more than her body. Look at her as a woman who holds value because of who she is, not because of her body. Looking at a woman directly in the eyes tells her that you have nothing against her and that you have nothing to hide. So the fact that they weren't looking at me in the eyes tells me that there was something there that they were afraid of or ashamed of. So this is really, really sad, but I believe that I experienced eye rape, like men looking at my body and lusting after me because I could see it in their eyes. People in the church who couldn't control their eyes, I could just see it. They wouldn't look me in the eyes, but they did look at my body, and I could tell what was happening. I believe I had a spiritual sense, even though I wasn't even aware of it at that time. And now, looking back, like, it's so obvious to me. And this is absolutely disgusting, and it makes me want to puke. But we knew that it was a known fact that there were men in the church who knew the shapes of all the women's bodies, and if one of the women accidentally showed their shape too much, for some reason, I don't even know how, but if they showed their shape too much, then the men would talk to her and get her to change the pattern of her dress so that she could be more modest and hide the shape of her body more. That's just sickening. I know for a fact that there were a lot of cases of actual sexual abuse, and like I said, I don't think I was one of those cases because I can't remember anything like that. They were in, not just in our church, but I know that in lots and lots of Mennonite churches there are so many cases of sexual abuse, and it's terribly sad. And I know that a lot of men watch pornography, and religion is just a place to hide your sin. And religion is so far from the heart of God that it creates loopholes where people can hide in plain sight. Even leaders in the church can just hide in plain sight and be doing all of these terrible things hidden but in plain sight. Like, it's just horrible. And so if you are one of those people who's been sexually abused, I'm so sorry, and I just want you to know that God has so much more for you than what you've been through, and he wants to heal those wounds. And all of this combined with the fact that I was not taught much about sex made for a recipe of disaster when I did get married. Sex was not safe or fun or pleasurable. And I just want to say that my parents did try to teach me the best that they could about sex, and I really appreciate that. But it still wasn't a very open or common topic, and I knew in my head, like, the act itself, but when it came down to having a sex drive or wanting sex for myself or wanting to experience love in that way. Like I literally had no sex drive when we got married. Like absolutely none. I didn't even want to have sex. And I had told myself for years that I wasn't attractive and that no guy would want me. And so like when Mike was interested in me, I definitely liked him, but it was more like as a person. Like I liked his personality and I liked who he was, but I didn't know what I wanted in sex. I just didn't know anything. Like as far as like I knew the act of sex itself, but I didn't know anything more than that. And so it was just like a really awkward time, and having to choose to open up to it was really painful. It was really hard. And physical touch, it really causes a certain reaction in your mind when you have a lot of self-hatred, when you hate yourself, or if you're suppressed emotionally and your spouse touches you in a way that's intended to make you feel loved. It really causes a painful reaction. And physical touch, it really hurt my heart because it targeted the lie that I just wasn't worth that kind of love. And sex felt more like a predator slash a victim type of situation than a husband-wife situation. So that's kind of the backstory of how I struggled so much with sex, or why. And so next episode I will be talking more about like how I worked through it and how I overcame it. And I wanted to mention really quick that I just wrote a book about sexual wholeness, bringing couples together physically, spiritually, and emotionally. And it talks about my story, and it talks a lot about the practical, spiritual, and emotional sides of sex and how to work through a lot of internal pain and find emotional healing. So this link will be in the description box below if you want to check it out. I'm really excited and grateful that I get to share this online. And so that's going to be all for this video, and I pray that this helps you to know that you're not alone. And even if you didn't grow up Mennonite, maybe you have a different type of reason why you feel emotionally suppressed and shut down in sex, and just know that you're not alone. There are so many women who struggle with these things, and you have hope because Jesus has died to give you hope, and he's risen from the dead so that you can have life again, and your emotions don't need to stay dead. You can come alive and find a new life and a new joy and new hope and new peace. And so I just pray that that happens for you. So thank you so much for listening to this episode, and I will be back with another episode. Bye.